Hello, I'm Kieran Beer, and welcome to this ACAMS Videocast. I'm really honored today to be interviewing Dennis Lormel of DML Associates. Dennis is a good friend of ACAMS. Dennis, you've been really involved with ACAMS for forever, I think, kind of.
Yeah, ACAMS is a great organization, and I've just enjoyed my affiliation and my friendship. So, I look forward to the future and continuing the relationship.
And Dennis is the founding director of the FBI's anti-terror unit, terror finance unit, TFOS,
Right.
New developments that have brought about the thought that one of the big focuses for the FBI should be domestic terror. And maybe you could talk a little bit first about where the FBI is coming from and this initial talk, that this initial release that came out of it.
Definitely. And let me just back up a little bit to start to frame that, is that we haven't talked about domestic terrorism here at ACAMS very frequently. I noticed in the last year there's been more interest. When we've done terrorist financing panels, people have asked me specifically, why don't we talk about domestic terrorism? And so getting to your question, domestic terrorism has really taken on a life, so to speak, of its own after unfortunate recent shooting brought a lot of attention to it. And I think the seminal point now was the shooting in New Zealand, where you had the shooting in 2 mosques by an individual there. And that coupled then with what we've seen and what we're seeing around the world is an incredibly problematic situation, and it's a growing problem. And to set the stage, though, domestic terrorism isn't a new problem. Domestic terrorism has been here forever. And since there's been a country, we've had domestic terrorists. We haven't focused as much attention since 9/11, after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and we set up TFOS. Even then, we were specifically dealing with domestic issues. And we saw some very significant domestic cases after 9/11 again. So they were investigating more quietly. They didn't get the notoriety. But now, unfortunately, with the active shooter situations, and an interesting thing is, from an FBI perspective, the FBI has now changed where initially these active shooter situations were considered violent crimes, and we treated hate crimes and these related crimes as violent crimes. The FBI now has come out and said, no, these are domestic terrorist acts. The biggest domestic terrorist problems we had in the run-up to 9/11 and after 9/11 were really the environmentalists, the different animal rights groups and things like that. And they were a significant problem.
We did have Timothy McVeigh.
Yeah,
Was he
absolutely.
kind of considered?
Yes, and that was the first really
a kind of a precursor.
Attack. Yes, it was definitely a precursor. And clearly, in and around 9/11 and after 9/11, there were those one-off events. Fortunately, nothing that grew to the magnitude of McVeigh, but there were serious problems. And so now, after the active shooter situations, we're looking at the hate crimes, the white supremacists, and we've seen a lot more of it manifest itself in the public domain. And so we're seeing more and more of these situations, and the FBI is actively now looking at that and treating that as domestic terrorism. So in every one of these instances where we have these active shooters, the FBI takes a 2-track approach to investigations. They initiate a violent crime investigation, and they initiate a domestic terrorism investigation. And certainly they run them parallel, and at some point they're going to merge, and one will take precedence over the other.
And I mean, the domestic terrorism is to find out, the connections, and if that person is acting entirely alone. And so you might want to comment on that, but I'm going to also put out this thought for a minute, that these are a little bit weird in that people may be sort of acting alone, but they're kind of copycat. There's online networks and online encouragement. In fact, these people seem to be kind of loners, but they seem to have some community online or something like that.
So again, let me set a backdrop for this.
Yeah.
In the 90s, these people were actively engaged in groups. There were certain groups of white supremacists and groups of other like-minded individuals who came together as a group, almost like a terrorist organization. They were organizations. But in the 90s, the FBI did an incredibly good job of undercover work, and they infiltrated those groups. So what that led to is that the groups fragmented, and they've intentionally been individualized. It's the internationalization of domestic terrorism. So I'll break that down a little bit for you. And it goes right to the point of your comment, Kieran, is that in domestic terrorism, these are domestic actors. In the United States, it's U.S. citizens. In New Zealand, it's New Zealanders. In the UK, it's Brits. But
it's Andre Breivik in Norway.
Yes, and start there with Norway. That inspired New Zealand. New Zealand inspired El Paso. And so these individuals, and this is why I call it the internationalization of domestic terrorism, although they're domestic actors who are going to carry out their acts in their home country, they're interconnected. They communicate on the internet. They find chat rooms and a lot of encrypted rooms that they can go into and exchange ideas, exchange manifestos. They read the manifestos. So in New Zealand, he read the manifesto of the actor in Norway. And there is an incredible internet presence and internet activity among these people.
And there is some sort of shared literature and everything
Yes.
that they're reading. I mean, I think there's some, and again, I'm going to say this with a little bit of it because I don't have the facts in front of me, but I think there's a few like kind of Russian nationalist writers that play into some of the common. It's not just Mein Kampf anymore, but there's a sort of body of literature and everything that people are sharing.
Yeah, and the Bible of this literature, the Turner Diaries, going back into the 90s, 80s, with an individual named Pierce, who wrote those Turner Diaries, and he's written a few other books, and more than not, they're kind of the Bibles of this breed. And I think one of the real challenges for law enforcement with domestic terrorism is that we don't have domestic terrorism legislation. And unfortunately, we do have tremendous freedoms in the United States, as do other countries. And more unfortunate, it's not against the law to hate. It's not against the law to profess hate. You have the right to free speech. And so you can say very hateful, very horrific things, and you're not breaking the law. So the FBI is a lot more challenged in their ability to be proactive, and especially, as you pointed out before, that we're dealing with one-off individuals who are acting alone as lone wolves. And so it becomes a lot more challenging for law enforcement to be proactive, and that's where the public comes in, and that's where we as a community and anti-money laundering, it's one of the things I love about ACAMS, is how progressive ACAMS is, and how ACAMS takes the lead in a lot of these areas in terms of working groups and thought leadership in, how do we get out in front of it, how can we be more proactive?
So I guess that does lead to that question. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, when you say we don't have a domestic terrorism legislation, would that mean that you're sort of saying maybe we need something that at least puts some kinds of restrictions around people? I mean, there is hate speech legislation, which I don't know, maybe having a mixed result right now in Germany, for instance, given its history, obviously, and there's other places where there is like hate speech legislation that there are limits to what you can do, or is it that the police and FBI need more powers for if someone is meeting certain standards that you have greater ability to do surveillance or something?
Well, first and foremost, we need to be very careful, and any legislative fix has to protect the rights of our citizens. So we don't want to overstep authority, but we do need some sort of legislation to criminalize domestic terrorism, to give the FBI the ability to use more intrusive investigative means and really the proactive things that they do in the international terrorism cases that they can't use in the domestic terrorism cases.
And so, I think it's the buzzword here at ACAMS, and it's not a bad buzzword, is typologies. And Clearly, these individuals, it's different. It's harder to necessarily identify them, although it seems to me that in the course of our conversation, we've come up with a few potential typologies. Someone who is online in a certain way and citing certain kinds of things. What would be, is there some typologies for who might be a domestic terrorist?
Yeah, at this point, there really aren't specific typologies. However, let's break that down a little bit because you're absolutely right. It's the use of social media. So we need to look at the internal capabilities and the external capabilities in terms of monitoring. So from an external standpoint, social media would be important. That how outspoken they are on social media. There are certain things, certain networks of people that work together that would be indicative of problems or potential problems. So we need to do a better job, and I think this is where ACAMS can play a thought leadership role. Is we need to have a working group to have this discussion and to identify it, because we do have people in this industry who know and who can put pieces together, because it's pretty fragmented right now. And so we need to do that. From a financial standpoint, the real problem we have with these types of people is they have, for the most part, legitimate income, and a bank or a financial institution.
And they're self-funding generally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what will happen is that until they act out and they carry out their act, they're not known. They haven't done anything from a financial standpoint that would raise red flags or cause alerts, or unlikely that they would. So now it's when they act out and in a reactive posture and in a reactive manner, when the bank runs the name of the individual, and oh my gosh, we have an account relationship, we have a credit card relationship, we have some type of relationship with this individual. I call that reactive, it's a reactive situation, but we need to be urgently reactive. I use that term quite a bit, having a sense of urgency, and having, I think one of the things we can do from a financial institution standpoint is to have people specially trained so we understand the crime problem. I think in dealing with terrorism, and now the threat of domestic terrorism, there are two approaches. There's a strategic approach and a tactical approach. The tactical approach includes the financial institutions. What can we do from a financial institution perspective to identify potential domestic terrorists? What can we do once they are identified or they strike out to be urgently reactive in a response to help law enforcement in any way we can? Because one of the things I want to do if I'm working that type of case is I want to put a timeline together. When did this person, when did this manifest itself, that those people had that type of mindset, and where are the changes? I think what you see in a lot of these individuals after the fact, when people close to them are interviewed, they start to talk about changes or traits that they should have realized were problematic.
It's often even like within the last year before this behavior, that they knew something was wrong, and I'm not entirely surprised kind of thing. You hear these.
The strategic side of it is more, holistically as a society, we have to take steps outside of the financial realm to identify and interdict these people beforehand. And that's where the parallel is with the homegrown violent extremists. Homegrown and violent extremists, the difference between them and domestic terrorists is that they pledge allegiance to ISIS or Al-Qaeda, even though they're here and they're U.S. citizens, just like the hate crimes individuals and the domestic radicals. These people, they pledge allegiance, and their ideology then is that of an international terrorist, whereas the ideology of the domestic terrorists is the hate, is the white supremacy, whatever their cause is.
But I think you've raised an interesting thing, and kind of a project for ACAMS is that there really needs to be some more discussion about this.
The one thing I can talk about, though, that has come out, and if you listen to Frederick Reynolds on my panel this morning, Frederick talked about the code that they use, that the domestics are using in messaging each other through financial transactions. That's a big thing. So one of the things that the FBI is looking at right now is the peer-to-peer transactions and the messaging that goes on in the peer-to-peer. So there's actually, even in the financial transactions, are probably going to be pretty minimal. But the idea is that there's communications going on.
So you mean, let me just understand this, because this is totally new to me, and you're saying this is an interesting thing that came up in your panel this morning, that messages are being delivered from, say, one white supremacist to another in like a Venmo $5. There's also a message attached or something like that. I know. And I named Venmo. I'm not sure whether the technology allows that but I mean that kind of instant messaging.
Yeah. So I think that law enforcement is working with some financial institutions on that and trying to get their arms around it. Okay, now what can we do as a community between law enforcement and the private sector to address this? And this is another thing that's a strength of ACAMS, is you promote public-private partnerships. One of the most important public-private partnerships we can have is to deal with terrorist issues, and now with this threat of domestic terrorism. And it's really interesting because I've seen a lot of interest generated here at ACAMS on our members. How do we identify domestic terrorists? What can we do? Yeah. And I really see a kind of a swell here, a groundswell of interest in this, and I think it's a really good time for us to have to talk about a working group and next steps moving forward.
And how complicated does this get? Because in addition to the domestic terrorists, lots of concern has been expressed about the fact that ISIS has been defeated, but in fact they're still around, and some of them are returning to their countries. And
the thought that ISIS is defeated is wrong. It's absolutely wrong. ISIS is not defeated. ISIS went from having
some
caliphate,
setbacks,
but very substantial setbacks.
Yes.
So they lost their caliphate.
But they didn't need it in some ways to do some of their...
and in fact, now they're more nimble because they don't have a caliphate, they don't have that overhead. But what they did do is they were able to hide an awful lot of their wealth, knowing that they were going to change their business model, so to speak. So ISIS has become an insurgency, and in some ways they're more dangerous because now they've kind of spread out. And both ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they aspire to have attacks in the United States. The problem is they don't have the capacity now to do so, but they are reaching out and growing around the world. So that is, and it will be, and it continue to be, a real problem. So that, from the public perspective, it was everybody, from a sentimental standpoint or from an emotional standpoint, we're talking about the threat of the international, and especially we were talking about the threat of the homegrown violent extremists and the foreign fighters and the returning foreign fighters. That's more of a problem in the UK and in Europe than it is here.
It is in the US right now.
Yeah, but then all of a sudden you hear Director Wray testify before Congress and other FBI executives testify before Congress. We have the shootings, the domestic issues here. And then there's an outcry of why aren't we doing more on domestic terrorism? And I actually heard somebody go as far as to say that domestic terrorism should be the number one. We don't really need to concentrate because we don't have the same threat on the international side. No, that's not the case at all. We have a significant international threat. We have a significant domestic threat. So we have to balance the response to both. And I think that's going to be important.
Yeah. Well, Dennis, I think you've given us a lot to think about, and I mean, again, I think it's a great, maybe one of the next things for ACAMS.
Yeah, well, Kieran, I want to thank ACAMS, thank you for your support, because we've had the discussion. I think it's important to continue to have terrorist financing in the panels, in the thoughts. ACAMS today has been a tremendous platform for articles about terrorism, and I owe Carla a couple of articles now. I plan on writing a couple of articles on the domestic issue, and one of them I want to compare and contrast the domestics with the homegrown violent extremists, and getting that message out and promoting awareness to that through ACAMS and other channels, I think is a fabulous thing to do.
Well, thanks, Dennis, and thank you for being here. Dennis Lormel at DML Associates.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for watching this ACAMS videocast. I'm Kieran Beer, Chief Analyst for ACAMS. And if you've liked what you've seen, then please subscribe. We hope to see you again. Thanks.